It doesn't make much sense to pretend that something that is very definitely happening to you is never going to happen to you, but that is how most of us behave when it comes to getting older. And I think the most common thing you hear people say about it with this tone of sort of sad resignation is, well, it beats the alternative, which I thought was an okay thing to say until it dawned on me that it really means that the only thing worse than being old is being dead. And I used to feel that way too. Old to me meant sad and sick, and I didn't really want to think about it much. When it crossed my mind, I flipped the channel. But then I started a project called So When Are You Going to Retire? Inspired by my partner's parents, and began interviewing people over 80 who work and learning about longevity. And finding older people to talk to was incredibly easy. They were interesting, they were doing all sorts of interesting things, working class, professional, and people were always saying, oh, you should meet the guy who sells ices in the park, or my Aunt Lucille, or my accountant. But this, and it didn't surprise me that they were incredibly diverse and in the world in very interesting ways. But what did surprise me was this gap, this discrepancy that began to emerge between what I had simply assumed it would be like to be that old and the reality. So why the disconnect? What were some of my grim assumptions about what the future held? Well, the grimmest was that I would end my days drooling under a bad Van Gogh print in some ghastly institutional hallway. The percentage of Americans over 65 in nursing homes is 4%, and it's dropping. It's down from 5 in the last decade. Over half, these statistics, by the way, are all US statistics, so over half of the oldest old, which is 85 and up, can go about their everyday lives without any personal assistance. So another preconception, dementia lurks. So if you subtract that 4% of the Americans over 65, 90% of the remainder is cognitively fit. Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. We don't know how it works. We aren't anywhere near a cure, and we may not find a cure, but it is not typical of aging. The real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss. At the other end of the spectrum, about 20% of people seem to escape cognitive decline entirely. Think about it, right? We all know some of those super sharp 90-year-olds. Most of us will experience some decline in specific abilities, memory processing, and that damn tip of the tongue thing. But the brain of a healthy older person can do just about everything a healthy younger person can do. It just takes a little longer, and new data shows that it's because we have more data to sift through. Another assumption, old people don't have sex. Well, sexual activity does tend to decline with age, but my 74-year-old friend Robin is having the best sex of her life, and she is not an anomaly. Retirement homes are hotbeds of romance. Thank you, Viagra. People who make sex a priority and embrace a broader notion of the forms it can take, think slow, whole body, playful, can enjoy deeply satisfying sex for as long as we want. I also assumed that old people were depressed because, they were old and they were going to die soon. It turns out that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. It's called the U-curve of happiness, and it's been borne out by study after study in the US and around the world. It obtains independent of economic status and marital status. And it's because as we turn 80, we get better at dealing with negative emotions like anger and envy and fear. You don't have to be a Buddhist or a bodhisattva or a billionaire to experience these changes. The aging process itself confers them on the healthy brain. And that is the neurological underpinnings of that curve. So slowly, skeptically, gears grinding, my point of view began to shift. I realized that old age was almost certainly going to be different and way better than the grim slide into depression, dementia, and puffy white shoes of my nightmares, although I am still worried about the shoes. And that was before I had to go see a podiatrist. So why the disconnect? How come these facts take so many people by surprise? Because of ageism, treating people differently on the basis of how old we think they are. It is the last socially sanctioned prejudice. We don't like it when people make sexist or racist comments, right? But who even blinks when older people are described as foolish or feeble or even repulsive? And we experience ageism anytime someone assumes we're too old for something, a task, a relationship, a haircut, or too young, instead of finding out who we really are and what we're capable of. Ageism is to age what racism is to race. Both are socially constructed ideas that change over time and that serve a social and economic purpose. They are not about how we look. They are about what people in power want, how we look to mean. Stereotyping underlies ageism, as it does all isms, the assumption that all members of a group are the same. It is ageist to assume that all olders are wise or frail, or that kids are like that, because ageism cuts both ways. Ageism is why people think that everyone in a retirement home is the same age. That would be old, even though residents can span 4 decades. So imagine thinking that way about a group of people from 20 to 60. That never happens. It is why the last box on those marketing checklists, like 18 to 26 and then 27 to 34, they stop at 65, as though everyone over 65 does the same thing and buys the same crud. I turned 64 2 days ago, so I'm just teetering, and you're lucky you caught me on my last year of being a viable person in the world. Stereotypes are always a mistake, but especially when it comes to age, because the older we get, the more different from one another we become. That's a social, biological, physical fact. And it's why geriatricians say, if you've seen one 80-year-old, you've seen one 80-year-old. People aren't born ageist, but it starts in early childhood, around the same time that attitudes about race and gender start to form. That's a real ad. Kids are exposed to negative stereotypes about aging all the time, from ads for wrinkle creams to children's books, that have the passive granny or the evil crone and not much in between. Older people can be the most ageist of all because we have had a lifetime to internalize these stereotypes, and we've never questioned them. Like everyone else, I internalized these prejudices without realizing it. I had to acknowledge it and confront them. Senior moment quips, for example, I stopped making them when it dawned on me that when I lost the car keys in high school, I didn't call it a junior moment. You hear people say, I don't feel old all the time. What they really mean is, I don't feel ugly or useless or helpless or any of the other bad things for which old has become an all-purpose placeholder. And we experience those feelings all our lives, right? They're not a function of age. You can feel that at 13 as easily as at 93. Ageism is why teenagers get no respect, and why 20-somethings who aren't having peak lives every minute feel overwhelmed, and why 30-year-old women freak out about getting over the hill, and why 40-year-olds can't get job interviews. Ageism affects everyone. But what never dawns on most of us is that the fears are fears of aging, whether getting sick or running out of money or ending up alone, can be better or worse depending on the society in which we age, right? And this culture, is grotesquely youth-centric, and it amplifies those anxieties. Ageism feeds on denial, our reluctance to admit that we will get old, that we are aging. It is denial when old pals cringe at public mention of how long we've known each other instead of delighting in it. It is denial when people bridle at being politely offered a seat on the bus. It is denial when we snap up products that tout their anti-aging properties or promise agelessness. Aging means living, and living means aging. If you're not aging, you're dead. Denial blinds us to ageism in ourselves and perpetuates it in 1,000 different ways. When we see people as other than us, right, other nationality, other religion, other from us, even a sports team, then their well-being starts to seem less of a human right. And that is why, one reason why, 5 out of 6 incidents of elder abuse go unreported. That's in the US. I don't know what it's like here, but I'd hazard a guess that it's not a lot better. We don't talk about elder abuse, and neither do many victims who are embarrassed by their vulnerability and ashamed to talk about it, and ashamed to ask for help because they think they may not deserve it. That is internalized ageism at work, right? When you hear all these messages your whole life long that your older self is less valuable than your younger one, and it becomes part of your own identity. And when people don't ask for help and call out abuse, that reinforces the structural discrimination that makes it a problem in the first place. When labels are hard to read, or handrails are missing, or containers are hard to open, we think, I should be more limber, or I should be stronger, or I should be better prepared. We think those obstacles are our fault instead of the result of lousy design or crappy public policy. Aging is an accomplishment, but in this culture, we're conditioned to feel shame instead of pride. This paves the way for a host of unhealthy behaviors, from denial to contempt. That's what's going on when people refuse to use walkers or wheelchairs because the stigma is so great, even when the alternative is never leaving home. We blame our own aging, our failure to age successfully. Don't get me started on that. Instead of confronting the ageism that makes these barriers acceptable and these natural transitions shameful. It is not loving a man that makes life harder for gay guys. It's homophobia. It's not having a vagina that makes life harder for women. It's sexism. And it is not the passage of time that makes aging so much harder than it should be. It is ageism. But until feminism taught us new scripts, women blamed themselves for a second-class status instead of systematic discrimination. There is enormous overlap between ageism and sexism. Surprise. Also with ableism, although denial makes us act as though people with disabilities never get old and old people never get disabled. The more clearly we see these social forces at work in ourselves and in the world at large, the easier it is to envision alternative, more positive, more accurate narratives. The longer we wait to challenge them, the more damage it does to ourselves, our sense of self, and our place in the world. A growing body of evidence shows that attitudes towards aging have an actual measurable effect on how our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. There's no inherent reason for the effect to be negative, but an ageist culture tells us that wrinkles are ugly, and that old people are incompetent, and that it's sad to be old. And when we assimilate those stereotypes, they become part of our identity, and that influences how our brains and bodies function. My favorite experiment is where scientists primed a bunch of college students with negative age stereotypes, words like forgetful, Florida, and bingo. I don't know what they'd swap out in the UK for Florida, but I'm sure there's something. So they flashed the terms too quickly on a computer screen for people to be conscious of them. And then they measured the speed at which that group of students and the control group walked to the elevator. And the group that had been negatively primed walked more slowly. So these are 18-year-olds, right? Imagine the effect on older people for whom the terms are more relevant and therefore, of course, more likely to become self-fulfilling prophecies for no good reason. People with more positive feelings about aging behave differently from those convinced that getting older means becoming irrelevant or pathetic. They do better on memory tests, and they have better handwriting, which is an indicator of neurological well-being. They can walk faster and are more likely to recover fully from severe disability, and they live longer, and not just a little bit, an average of 7.5 years longer. So everyone agrees, whether you love old people or hate old people, that health has the biggest effect on how we age and how much it costs. So think what a national anti-ageism campaign, which Help Age International is starting to inaugurate worldwide in the fall. So think what that would do to extend not just lifespan, but health span. The workplace is where many people, men in particular, first become aware of age discrimination. And workers at both ends of the spectrum face discrimination, which is really important to remember in terms of the hideous response to the Brexit vote. You know, economic inequity affects everyone. It doesn't break down by generations. So millennials, in the US at least, are criticized for having no work ethic and needing their hands held, and they have trouble getting a foothold. And in Silicon Valley, engineers are getting Botox and hair transplants before key interviews, and these are educated, skilled, white guys in their 30s. So imagine the effect further down the food chain. Older people are damned if we work for taking jobs away from younger people, even though that is a fallacy. Google lump of labor. The amount of labor is not fixed, blah, blah, blah. And we are damned if we don't work for mooching off younger workers, and we're really damned if we're laid off because experience is a liability in an ageist world. Longer lives require working longer and saving more, but age discrimination on the workplace is on the rise. Workers at the top of their game find themselves unceremoniously shown the door, perhaps after being treated differently from younger colleagues or excluded from key meetings. And it is incumbent on workers of all ages to keep up with technology and social media and to keep an open mind. Your boss may be younger than your granddaughter, but it doesn't mean she has nothing to teach you. And it is just as important to call out discrimination when we encounter it and question the rationales that employers use to justify it. That older workers are less productive, less dependable, less committed, less teachable, or less creative. And those are only a few. Not one of these stereotypes holds up under scrutiny, and it's often balanced out. I mean, older workers might hurt themselves, might take longer to recuperate from an injury, and of course very little of the workforce nowadays is even involved in jobs that involve physical labor, much less than used to be the case, but they hurt themselves less often, right? So it evens out. Push back, and we transform the landscape into a more equitable one for workers of all ages, right? The flex time, the accommodations also benefit caregivers, people caregiving for older or younger people, families, students, anyone looking for work-life balance in this always-on era. The more flexible arrangements required by older workers also benefit students, families, caregivers. It drives me nuts when some clown calls me young lady and expects me to feel complimented, but I didn't know why until I started thinking deeply about it. Because it's embarrassing to be called out as older until we quit being embarrassed about it. And it's not healthy to go through life dreading our futures. Everyone wakes up a day older. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we move from denial to acceptance, and maybe even all the way to embrace, the better off we'll be. That's when we throw off what geriatrician Bill Thomas calls the tyranny of still. The delusion that as long as we're still running up the stairs or still driving or still dating younger women, whatever, we all have our stills, we could stop the clock, as if that would be a good thing. Why on earth do we stop celebrating personal growth, the incredibly important ability to adapt to and change from life all our lives until we hit sort of late middle age, whatever muddly stage my interlocutor is in? Of course, I'm beyond that now, thank heavens. Because I'm so much older. But it's a dumb goal, and it's punitive because everything changes. We all age at different rates, socially, mentally, and physically. So it's why it's important to tell the truth if someone asks your age, but it's also important to ask what difference that number makes, right? To push back against the idea that that number has some fixed meaning, because the older we get, the less reliable an indicator it is of pretty much anything about a person. I guess I need to change this now. I'm 64. I know I'm not young. I don't see myself as old. And I know an awful lot of people feel the same way. So we're in the grips of this cruel paradox, right? We aspire to grow old. Do you know anyone who wants to die young? And yet, we dread the prospect. So we spend a lot of energy sustaining the illusion that the old are somehow not us. That's the denial thing. And that's why I've become an old person in training, a phrase I appropriated from geriatrician Joanne Lynn. So becoming an old person in training bridges that us-them divide, right? It loosens the grip of that exhausting illusion. You can sort of slip off that hamster wheel of pretending that you can prevent something inevitable and powerful from happening. So it means ditching preconceptions, looking at and listening to the olders around us with an open mind, and re-envisioning our place among them. The sooner we make this imaginative leap, the better. All change starts with awareness. It is not easy to undo beliefs we've held all our lives, especially when they involve looking at your own bias. It's uncomfortable. The women's movement called it consciousness raising. Think of it as a mindset alteration. Some places to start: look for ways in which you are ageist instead of for evidence that you're not. You can't challenge bias unless you're aware of it, and everyone is biased some of the time. I catch myself thinking ageist stuff all the time. Talk to people significantly older and younger than you, and listen carefully. If you don't know many, seek them out. It's really important to have friends of all ages. The next time you wonder whether an outing or an outfit or an attitude is age appropriate, reconsider the question. There is no such thing. What would a truly intergenerational world look like? How could we work together to bring it about? Change ripples outward when we point out ageist behaviors and beliefs in the world around us without being a jerk about it. That's the hard part. Because if you just confront someone, then they just resist. But if you can get them to think for a minute about why they said what they said, then people learn, hopefully. So train yourself to notice when everyone in a group is the same age. And unless there's a really good reason, speak up about it. Assume capacity, not incapacity. Don't assume someone is too old or too young to weigh in on a topic or take on a responsibility. If you're feeling ambitious, start a consciousness-raising group. This powerful tool catalyzed the women's movement in the 70s. And what it did was it made women realize that the problems they were facing, that they didn't feel like they could get ahead in the world or, an identity, or they thought that, material possessions would, give them what they needed. Once they got together in consciousness-raising meetings and shared notes, they saw that these were widely shared problems, right, that required a collective political solution. And that's where we need to go with our thoughts about getting older. You hear people say, "Don't call me old," all the time, or stuff like, "My mom's 94, but she's not old." Someone said that to me recently. But culture is far from fixed. Look at gender, right? Western culture used to view it as a rigid binary, and we understand now that it is far more fluid. So if gender can be conceived of this way, why on earth not age, which is obviously intrinsically a spectrum. There is no line in the sand, no crossover between old and young, after which it's all downhill. And as we get older, we know this, we know it intuitively. Let's call it out. What does experience tell you? Anyone else in the room have any fun over 40? Working together, we can overturn the grotesque notion that 2/3 of life is decline. Expect pushback. Social change unsettles. It's worth it. What kind of a world do we want to grow old in? And for our children and grandchildren, who may well live to be 100, to inherit. If marriage equality is here to stay, why not age equality? If gay pride has gone mainstream and millions of people now take pride in identifying as disabled, why not age pride? The only reason that idea sounds outlandish is this is the first time you've encountered it. It won't be the last. Longevity is here to stay. Everyone is aging. It's time to end ageism, and it's time for a radical aging movement.